A continuing cover-up. Is it possible that Calvin's tyrannical influence over Geneva, which was often so unchristlike, was a direct result of his view of God as a harsh sovereign, more ready to condemn than to save? Tragically, that view of God persists among many Calvinists today. Calvinists have avoided the truth about John Calvin the man. The booklet put out by John Piper and his pastoral staff at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis opens with historical information. It begins, John Calvin, the famous theologian and pastor of Geneva. And that is it for the historical information. There is not one word of the oppressive behavior of this Protestant Pope, which we have documented in chapter 5. Is it really fair to readers and to listeners to praise Calvin without telling the truth? Doesn't that give a false impression? Isn't Calvin's conduct as important as his theology? Aren't the two ultimately related? In a more recent book, Piper purports to tell the truth faithfully about Augustine, Luther, and Calvin, whom he calls three famous and flawed fathers in the Christian Church, and thereby to show how the faithfulness of God triumphs over the flaws of men. Piper declares that his aim in this book is that the glorious gospel of God's all-satisfying, omnipotent grace will be savored, studied, and spread for the joy of all peoples, in a never-ending legacy of sovereign joy. All peoples, including the multitudes predestined to destruction? Can he be serious? And sovereign joy? What is that? Calvinism's gospel of omnipotent grace will be savored, studied, and spread for the joy of the non-elect, who have been foreordained to eternal doom and born into this world without any hope of changing their fate? What mockery! Yet the Calvinist seems blind to what his theory has done to the God who is love, and to how it destroys any sense of urgency and responsibility to preach the gospel. Piper reminds us that the standard text on theology that Calvin and Luther drank from was Sentences by Peter Lombard. 9/10 of this book consists of quotations from Augustine. Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Calvin immersed himself in the writings of Augustine, as we can see from the increased use of Augustine's writings in each new edition of the Institutes. Paradoxically, one of the most esteemed fathers of the Roman Catholic Church gave us the Reformation. Piper considers this paradox to be good. We do not, and for the many reasons we are giving, among them Rome's heresies that were carried over into the Reformation by Luther and Calvin. Why have I been so harshly criticized for pointing out the very Catholic connection that Piper admits? His supposed exposé of Calvin's flaws is almost a whitewash. Piper admits that 15 women were burned at the stake, and that there were some cruelties. The full truth, as we have seen, is far worse. All is largely excused, however, as Calvin's accommodation to brutal times, as though Christians have no higher standard than current custom, and as having been done in tribute and defense of Protestant martyrs in France. Piper writes, "The worst was his joining in the condemnation of the heretic Michael Servetus to burning at the stake in Geneva. Calvin argued the case against him. He was sentenced to death. Calvin called for a swift execution instead of burning, but he was burned at the stake on October 27, 1553. This has tarnished Calvin's name so severely that many cannot give his teaching a hearing. But it is not clear that most of us, given that milieu, would not have acted similarly under the circumstances. The times were harsh, immoral, and barbarous, and had a contaminating effect on everyone. There was in the life and ministry of John Calvin a grand God-centeredness Bible allegiance, and iron constancy. Under the banner of God's mercy to miserable sinners, we would do well to listen and learn. The conviction behind this book is that the glory of God, however dimly, is mirrored in the flawed lives of his faithful servants. With those sweet words, Piper really means that, under the banner of God's mercy to some miserable sinners, the favored elect may listen and learn. But the non-elect can't listen and learn. They are totally depraved and without understanding or hope, because Piper's God keeps them in blindness. And even if they could understand the message and wanted to believe, it would not be possible, because they have been damned from eternity past by an immutable decree of the Almighty. Is it really fair to readers and listeners to give such a false impression of sovereign joy to all peoples? And was it really a grand God-centeredness, Bible allegiance, and iron constancy that produced the ungodly and unbiblical tyranny under Calvin at Geneva? Review chapter 5 to see how Calvin is being protected by Piper. There were dozens of others burned at the stake, not just Servetus, and there were many Christians who did not practice torture and burning at the stake in Calvin's day, thus proving that no one needed to make accommodation to brutal times. Would Paul have, or John, or Christ? Why Calvin? Could it be that Calvin's view of God, as taking pleasure in damning billions he could save, fit right in with the harshness of the times? Given Calvin's doctrine, no accommodation to brutal times was necessary. And why doesn't Piper explain that the reason Calvin pushed for beheading was because that type of execution was for civil crimes, and the onus would not be on himself? But the charges pressed against Servetus by Calvin in court were theological and required the flames. Calvin was simply trying to circumvent the law. Do we praise him for that? 8 years later, Calvin was still advising other rulers to exterminate heretics like I exterminated Michael Servetus. Calvin was a victim of his times? No, a victim of his theology.